So, quick little poll here. Raise your hand if you believe the earth rotates around the sun. Really? Should we try this again? The answer might be in the affirmative. How many of you believe the earth rotates around the sun? I'm just going to go with the rest of you being lazy or shy, okay? Of course, the whole point being that in the 16th century, Galileo was arrested for that kind of idea, right? For thinking like that, for thinking that that reality was geocentric as opposed to heliocentric, right? And now we sort of just take it for granted. Why would you even begin to question that sort of thing? But here we have the narrative that was told up until Galileo's time, throughout the church, throughout the community, throughout the villages. Everything revolves around the earth. And over the history of humanity, we've had a lot of these challenges to the narratives that we have lived by, or the narratives that we have just sort of taken for granted. Our lives just exist for this purpose. So this morning I want to talk with you about these 7 sayings that are in the Gospel of John, the I am sayings. I am the bread of life. I am the light. I am the gate. You enter through me. I am the good shepherd. You're familiar with a lot of these sayings. In fact, I'd have to admit that the Gospel of John for years, well, since college, or a little in the middle of college, I absolutely detested the Gospel of John. Because for years, when I was a young adolescent, pre-adolescent, into my adolescent, young adult years, as I was going into college, the Gospel of John was sort of like the evangelical blueprint, right? I mean, you read the Gospel of John in sort of a binary kind of fashion, and you suddenly realize, you ain't getting into heaven unless you believe this. That's what Jesus is saying right here. I am the bread of life. You don't have eternal life unless you eat of me. And we were all like, amen, that's right. Then when I started taking philosophy classes and science classes and talking to my father-in-law, who was an amateur astronomer, and then dialoguing and then just thinking about things as I began to see a wider perspective, the Gospel of John became this narrow-minded, crazy idea book. And I dismissed it until maybe about 8 years ago when I started rethinking what John's Gospel was all about. And we'll get into that for a minute. And while we're doing that, I want you to think about this little question. What is Jesus talking about in this story? And the reason why I want you to think about this question, because I'm going to ask it again at the end, if we get there. I'm not always one to land the plane. You laugh, because you know it's true. And yet you still show up. So here's the question I want you to think about. What is Jesus talking about in this story? Now, before you answer it, I want to talk with you a little bit about narratives, a little more about narratives. We live by stories. We've talked about this before, but just as a reminder, stories guide our lives. We don't think about it, but you have stories that you tell in your family. I wrote a blog this past week about my grandfather. A number of people emailed me and thanked me for the story because it's just a very vivid sort of personal story about my grandfather taking me out to the farm and just my experience with him. And it wasn't particularly a deeply insightful story. It was just a warm kind of feeling story. And people emailed me and said, thank you for that. It was a beautiful story. It made me think of my relatives. Then my own relatives who come to church, my cousins who have been active in this church all of their lives, emailed me. I didn't even expect that. And they emailed me and said, thank you for telling about our great uncle. We called him Uncle Granddaddy Doak. And because he was a doctor and he had a ranch in Oklahoma. Did you read the blog? Okay, well, if you read the blog, I don't need to tell you. Anyway, that's okay. I'm just giving you a hard time. But I was surprised to get that email from some of my cousins. But it reminded me that the stories we tell in our families are guiding stories. And sometimes they're impeding stories, right? We have those stories too. We have those stories we can't shake, that somehow we've been told, or at least indirectly we think we've been told, or we've adopted, and so we still live by some of those stories that are hard for us to shake. So what is Jesus talking about in this story, I am the bread of life? How many of you watched the Super Bowl game earlier this last month? How many watched the Super Bowl game? Come on, a lot of people? Okay. If I were from another planet, and I came to visit at your house while you were watching the game, what might I conclude if I were from another planet? I mean, say I asked this alien that visited your house afterward, and I said, so what is the Super Bowl? This is what that visitor might have said. Well, Tom, the Super Bowl is a series of 30-second short films designed to fill you with an overwhelming urgency to laugh or cry while simultaneously convincing you that you are just one purchase away from happiness. Interrupted by a football game. Or in the case of this last one, interrupted by people dressed in sequined outfits and dancing sexual positions and whatnot on the TV. Interrupted by a football game. These stories become our stories, these epic battles between good and evil, right? That's what's getting marched out there. It's just like the old gladiators in the Roman Empire. It's the same kind of thing. Our team versus their team, or then we're sort of ambivalent because we don't care about either team. But we're being told these stories on the field as they duke it out and try to run this pigskin one way or the other. I mean, if you're just visiting, it looks a little crazy. It looks a little insane. And then to have these little short clips that seem designed to tell us one small, simple narrative, we're missing something. We're just one purchase away from having what we need. So what is Jesus talking about in this story? I am the bread of life. We live by a number of these narratives, and for thousands and thousands of years, we've gathered around stories because stories are important. Stories, whether conscious or unconscious, actually keep us together. They hold us together. We have stories in this community that we could tell. Some of us have been a part of this community for almost 14 years. We can tell the stories about Charles, or we can tell the stories about being over in Wesley Hall, or some of the early things that we did over there. These are our stories, and they help us hold together, but they also impede us, right? They can also hold us back. For thousands of years, there's been a significant meta-story, an overarching story of existence, one of the oldest stories that has existed for cultures everywhere, and it goes something like this. You'll recognize this story. Our tribe is the best. Our ideas are the best. And our tribe's God is the best God. So if you come and join us, it'll be great. If you don't, we'll beat you up anyway and take your stuff. Maybe I simplified too much, but you recognize the story, right? Our God versus your God, or their God. Our way of life versus your way of life. Our beliefs versus your beliefs. We have the best ideas, we have the right ideas, you have the wrong ideas. For some in the more recent past, their story may go like this. This being human is a way of just living out our biological evolution. There's nothing else really here going on, no bigger story, no bigger reality, no wider possibilities, no magical beings swooping down from the sky to save us, just fixed laws and a static reality that never changes, one big bang and millions of years later, an evolution of things to where we find ourselves with the survivor of the fittest or the most successful, and we have about 80 years or so, and then we live it out, and then we die. And we call this basically the materialistic view. That doesn't mean greed materialistic, it simply means that what you see is what you get. This is all we can talk about. It's all that we see. We don't know anything else. So this is the way life is. And that, too, is a narrative that a lot of people live by. So we have these fixed, sort of foundational ways of seeing the world that guide us. Some of it is implicit, some of it's conscious. But I want to suggest that there's another way of seeing these stories that doesn't have to rely on what you might call binary options. It's either this way or that way. It's either right or it's wrong. You're either with us or you're against us. You're Republican or you're Democrat. Right? We live in these binary worlds where everything seems to be one way or the other. And while that can be important in certain things, like when a doctor's operating on you and he wants to know which organ is the right one and which is the one you don't want to have operated on. I mean, there's some obvious sorts of things that it's helpful to have this dualistic reality, but the reality of life is becoming more clear to us that it's not binary. So I'll give you a little example of this possible narrative that we might adopt as we think about what Jesus means by this line. About 13.8 billion years, that's what a lot of scientists now sort of give as a given that the universe has been around. There was a single point in time, a concentrated point, so concentrated, a material of essence, possibility, that it eventually exploded, the Big Bang, and 13.8 billion years later, we're here. Now, it didn't just simply happen. It took 13.8 billion years. And in the first 3 to 4 billion years, it took almost that long to cool down the rocks and the bodies that had exploded from this concentrated mass. And then another 3 billion years, and you begin to get particles that are just sort of floating around and circulating and pulling and tugging with one another. And then about another billion years, you get atoms that are actually sort of forming positive, negative neutrons. These positive, negative forces within inside this material called atoms. And then eventually atoms combine with molecules, and then eventually molecules combine to create strange little primitive, simplistic organic material, until finally you have animals at about 500 million years ago, 400 million years ago, and then you have humans coming into the last bit of the picture. Now, here's what I was told by my father-in-law. My father-in-law was an amateur astronomer, and he loved this. And what was always challenging, this is Linda's father, what was always challenging with him was that he worked at what's now Lockheed Martin. He was an aeronautical space engineer. And what always challenged him was his Lutheran background, the narrative he'd grown up with, right? Which was God created everything, 7,000 years, 7 days. Who are we to judge what a day is in God's mind, right? Created man and woman. Then there was the fall. They rebelled against God. Then Jesus came and saved the world because Jesus died for sins. This was my father-in-law's upbringing. Many of you recognize this same narrative. But it didn't work for him because he was a thinking scientist that was curious, and that just didn't make sense to him. Life was far more mysterious than that. It didn't account for so many things. And so we'd sit at the dinner table after dinner, and I would just go at it with him, and he would go at it with me, and we'd have these wonderful conversations. And then he looked at me once, and he said, "Do you realize something?" And I said, "What?" He said, "Do you realize that if you thought about all these billions and billions of years, if you just think about it as a day, 24 hours, all right, and you start here, and you got 24 hours. If you come all the way down here," he said, "to 23 hours and 59 minutes and 59 seconds, that's when humanity came into the picture. At 1 second before the end of the 24-hour period." He looked at me and he says, "It's hard to get your head around. We're in the 1 second period. That's what we've been doing for the last second, is evolving as far as the big picture of things." He said, if you look at an atom and you go here and you put your neutron here, your electron's going to be at the other end of a football field. And what's in between that? And then he said, "Do you know what we know about space?" And I said, "Well, I suppose we're knowing a lot." He says, "No, we know about 4%. He said, 95 to 96% of what's out there in the universe, we don't know. It's dark matter, it's dark energy, it's just this mystery." And then he said, now we can split an atom, we can get subatomic, we can get even below that, we can get subatomic, we can get to quarks, and we can get to bosons. I'm not sure how you say that now, I forget. And he says you can get below that. He said, you can go 125 times smaller and smaller and smaller into the atomic structure, and there's still stuff below that. We can't figure out what's there. And I said to him, I said, "Well, what do you think that means?" And he says, "It means I'm not going to assume I know anything anymore. I'm just going to assume I'm going to try to live my life as best as I can, but I'm not going to assume the former narrative that I lived by." It was always interesting to me because what happened when he had basically deconstructed his faith was he wasn't sure what to put back. All of this awareness, it threw into question, what's the nature of the Bible then? So now I'm going to ask you, what did Jesus mean by the bread of life? Before you answer that, I'll make it even a little more complicated. Most New Testament scholars don't think Jesus said any of these things. Most New Testament scholars think the Gospel of John was written by a pseudonym, not even the John that followed Jesus around. It was written somewhere between 90 AD and 120 AD by one or two, maybe even three different authors under the name of John, and it follows a lot of the same content that you'll read if you read the first and second, third epistle of John later on in the New Testament. Maybe even Revelations, they think, was a part of these authors' writings, of this community. Some think it was a Gnostic community, some think it was something else, but it was clear that it was a Jewish community that had been exiled in Jerusalem. They'd been followers of Jesus, and it's important that you remember the followers of Jesus were not Christians. They didn't exist yet. They were Jews trying to be good Jews. Jesus had tried to remind them what being a good Jew was all about, given the context where they were and the history where they were, and they were trying to be good Jews, following the ideas of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus as a Jewish rabbi, but they were quirky, they were different. They had these weird new practices, like this whole Eucharist thing. And so they were exiled. Now you add to that, 70 AD, the Roman Empire got really mad at the Jewish community and the Christian community. Nero, the emperor in Rome, had blamed Christians for starting the fire and burning the temple in Rome, and there'd already been all these little skirmishes between the Jews who had been oppressed and the Roman Empire that ruled over them, and so they were crushed. The Jewish community, the Jewish city of Jerusalem was crushed. The temple was torn down. These Jews had scattered in every direction, and the Johannine community was scattered and somewhere around, they think maybe just outside of Jerusalem, in caves. And this is when these writings began to surface. And we found them in 1946 in Nag Hammadi documents. And what most scholars say is that they're not the words of Jesus. In fact, if you read that, what they say there's only one line in the Gospel of John that they think Jesus actually said. So what do they mean by Jesus saying, I am the bread of life? No one gets eternal life unless you come through me or unless you eat of my body. What does he mean? Well, I want to suggest one or two things very quickly. What we know so far about the reality of life is that binary doesn't always work. There's more mystery than there is conclusion. There's more unknown than there is known. But ask yourself this question: what are you hungry for? I'm not talking about lunch, because I know some of you immediately went there and went, well, it's almost noon, and you're going on and on now, and I don't know how long this is going to take, and Okay, people, wait a minute. Humanity came into the picture in the last second, and you're telling me that you're anxious? 13.8 billion years, and you're worried about making it to lunch, right? Or you're saying to your spouse, how long is it going to take you to get ready? Or you're waiting at the stoplight and you're going, how long is this light going to last? You're 1 second in the history of time right now. We get pretty anxious about stuff. We get anxious about things being binary, like the coronavirus, Now we got this anxiety that we're living with the coronavirus because the word comes out that it's deadly, and it can be deadly, and so we're all going to die. Our politics has us in these binary relationships with one another. We have to learn to see past the binary tendencies that we have. And we go there naturally because it's part of our biology, but then the question is, what exactly is Jesus saying? Or maybe we reframe that now. What is the community saying about Jesus when they say, when they have him say, I am the bread of life? What is a mystic, contemplative community in exile, living under the oppression of cruelty, possible death, violence, struggling to make ends meet? What are they saying when they're saying, Jesus said, I am the bread of life? And that's why I think it's hard for us to put our hands on it, because we've never been in that place for the most part. We live with plenty. We get impatient with stoplights. We get impatient with the preacher preaching too long. We get impatient because the music wasn't quite up to snuff this last time. Or, you know, I mean, we get, no, I'm just not, that's, yeah. It's a hypothetical. I'm speaking more about me. Right? We get impatient because we're dealing with this stress in our lives, because our partner's not acting the way we really would like them to act. We make much ado of nothing. Much to do with nothing. Is it much to do with nothing? Much to do with nothing. So my thought here for us to, and I'm not going to answer the question because I told you I'm not likely to land this plane, but I want you to think about this week what it is that you're really hungry for. For one thing, I think it changes as we get older, as we have circumstances change in our life. What is it we're hungry for? And what is it in our lives that's telling us we're hungry for this? Are we sure this is really what we need or what we're hungry for? That our lives are supposed to be this way. I think of people that I've been in counseling with who constantly tell me my life isn't where it should be. And I'm like, where do you think it should be? And they'll tell me what they think their life should be about, and I'll say, where did you get that idea? And then it takes a while, but you break it down and it becomes this narrative. They realize it's this narrative they've always grown up with. It's this narrative that they live with in the community that they're in. It's their tribe's narrative. It's the narrative they see on TV. Is it their narrative? What really makes you hungry? What do you really hunger for? Do you know? Do you really know what it is that gets you up in the morning or wakes you up in the middle of the night? Not because you're anxious, not because you're stressed out that you're not meeting what you think is your hunger, but because you can't wait to dive in. Because you can't wait for the sun to come up so you can get into it. What really makes you hungry? Jesus said, I am the bread of life. What does he mean by that? So next week, no, I'm not going to answer it. Why do you think I'm going to answer that? You think I have the answer to that question? I think where you'll begin to find it, yeah, somebody's like that. Yeah, you do. I think where you're going to begin to find it is when you can begin to let go of these either-or narratives, and you can begin to dive in to what is true for all of us, the very essence of our lives, the common needs that we share, the common thread that we share. Oh, I forgot, the starlings. My son Matthew and I and Linda were out when he was only 8 years old, and we were out in the countryside. And this wasn't the film that we took, but we saw the starlings out over a field because they gather in agricultural areas, farms and such. And they were making all these interesting shapes. And Linda and I were just going like, wow. Now, starlings can be very destructive. Keep that in mind. I understand that. But it's not either or, right? It's not. They're beautiful. Their patterns are beautiful. Yes, they're destructive, but they're beautiful, right? It's mystery. And they're making all these shapes, these amazing shapes. And my son looks up at them and is just watching them, and Linda and I are oohing and eyeing. And then my son, who's smart enough, young enough to maintain his curiosity, rather than to try to find some kind of other answer, he simply looks up and he says, who do you think is the leader up there? How do they know which way to go? Where do you carry disappointment in your life? In your body? You feel it, but where is it? Where is excitement when you feel it? In your body. If I cut you open, are we going to find it somewhere? Where is your anger? Where do you put that in your body? Is it really real? It's what you feel, but is it the story that's telling you to feel that? What does it mean to have the bread of life? That's what you get to think about this week. I'm not going to tell you. You can read the blog. I'll talk about it on the blog. Next week, we're going to think about what it means to be light. Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. These sayings have to do more with who we are here and now and how we live in relationship to everything else. What is at the very source of your life, at the very core of your life, that urges you to wake up and dive in. What is that?